So it's my great pleasure to welcome our chair for this reading part and meeting the writer of our time together, and that is Kate Haynes. And then Kate will introduce Nadifa Mohamed. So Kate is the director of Huza Press in Rwanda, and she is research associate at both Bath Spa and at Bristol. She's an Africanist, and she is the very, very lively and proactive editor of Africa in Words, which is an amazing blog site that I would recommend to everyone. And she has a budding interest in Somali writing, and it's that sort of forges the link that we have here this evening between herself, Kate Haynes, and Nadifa Mohamed. So you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be hosting this conversation with Nadifa Mohamed as part of the Great Writers Inspire at Home series. The next kind of nearly hour or so is really about putting you, the readers of the novel, in conversation with Nadifa as the writer of the book. But kind of to put that that conversation in context, I just wanted to introduce Nadifa very briefly. Nadifa Mohamed was born in Hargeisa in 1981 and moved to London in 1986. A move that was initially intended to be temporary but became permanent when civil war broke out, and her family was unable to return. She grew up in South London and she studied history and politics here at the University of Oxford. In 2013, she was selected as one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists, a list that has appeared every decade for the last 30 years and been very prescient in identifying voices with enduring significance within British fiction. And in 2014, she was named one of the most promising fiction writers south of the Sahara, under 40 by Africa 39, a collaboration between the Hay Festival and Nigeria's Rainbow Book Club. Her first novel, Black Mamba Boy, which we're going to be talking about now, was published in 2010 by HarperCollins in the UK, and it was longlisted for the Orange Prize, shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award, the John Llewellyn-Rhys Prize, the Dylan Thomas Prize, the Penn Open Book Award, and won the Betty Trask Award. Her second novel, The Orchard of Lost Souls, was published in 2013 by Simon & Schuster in the UK. So I just wanted to start this session by asking Nadifa to just read to us a little bit from Black Mamba Boy.
Okay. Hi everyone, thank you for coming here on this lovely day. I'll read just a short piece from the very beginning of the novel in Aden in 1935. The muezzin's call startled Jama out of his dream, and he pulled himself up to look at the sun rising over the cake-domed mosques, the gingerbread Adeni apartments glowing at their tips with white frosting. The black silhouettes of birds looped high in the inky sky, circling around the few remaining stars and the pregnant moon. The black planets of Jama's eyes roamed over Aden, the busy industrial steamer point, Crater, the sandstone old town, its curvaceous dun-coloured buildings merging into the Shum volcanoes, the Ma'ala and Sheikh Usman districts, white and modern, between the hills and sea. Wood smoke and infants' cries drifted up as women took a break from preparing breakfast to perform their dawn prayers, not needing the exaltations of the old muezzin. A vulture's nest encircled the ancient minaret, the broken branches festooned with rubbish, the nest corrupting the neighbourhood with the stench of carrion. The attentive mother fed rotting morsels to her chirruping chicks, her muscular wings unhunched and at rest beside her. Jama's own mother, Ambaro, stood by the roof edge, softly singing a song in her deep and melodious voice. She sang before and after work, not because she was happy, but because the songs escaped from her mouth, her young soul roaming outside her body to take the air before it was pulled back into drudgery. Ambaro shook the ghosts from her hair and began her morning soliloquy. Some people don't know how much work goes into feeding their ungrateful guts. Think they are some kind of sultan who can idle about without a care in the world. Head full of trash, only good for running around of trash. Well, over my dead body. I don't grind my backbone to dust to sit and watch filthy bottom boys roll around on their backs. These poems of contempt, these gabes of dissatisfaction, greeted Jama every morning. Incredible, meandering streams of abuse flowed from his mother's mouth, sweeping the mukadim at the factory, her son, long-lost relatives, enemies, men, women, Somalis, Arabs, Indians into a pit of damnation. Get up, you stupid boy. You think this is your father's house? Get up, you fool. I need to get to work. Jama continued to loll around on his back, playing with his belly button. Stop it, you dirty boy. You'll make a hole in it. Ambaro slipped off one of her broken leather sandals and marched over to him. Jama tried to flee, but his mother dived and attacked him with stinging blows. Get up. I have to walk 2 miles to work, and you make a fuss over waking up? Is that it? She raged. Go then, get lost, you good for nothing. Jama blamed Aidan for making his mother so angry. He wanted to return to Hargeisa, where his father could calm her down with love songs. It was always at daybreak that Jama craved his father. All his memories were sharper in the clean morning light, his father's laughter and songs around the campfire, the soft, long-fingered hands enveloping his own. Jama couldn't be sure if these were real memories or just dreams seeping into his waking life, but he cherished these fragile images, hoping that they would not disappear from him like his father had. Jama remembered traversing the desert on strong shoulders, peering down on the world like a prince, but already his father's face was lost to him, hidden behind stubborn clouds.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, one of the things we've been doing in the previous hour is kind of sharing passages which were particularly memorable to us about the book. And yeah, it was really great to hear you read that, because for me, that the kind of long-fingered hands of the father really kind of stayed with me as an idea. So yeah. This conversation is concerned about exploring the relationship between readers and writers, and so I wanted to start by asking you whether you have a particular reader in mind when you write, and how you work to address that reader, if you do, kind of through your writing process.
I don't think I do. I think that I'm basically writing for myself and working out things for myself. And my father's story, which this is very closely based on, not 100%, but very closely, was so fascinating to me and so strange and so revealing of lots of things that really I was talking to myself. And it was such a long, drawn-out process of writing it late at night on my own, stopping and starting, and really, apart from collaborating with my father and talking to him about his own life, it was a very private activity, and I didn't expect to publish it. I didn't intend to publish it until probably 2-3 years into the process. So I wasn't thinking about a public audience, and actually when it was published, it felt very jarring for both me and my father, where suddenly a private activity between us was seen as public property, and his life story felt like public property as well. So despite him always saying that he should have a book written about him because his life's been so interesting, when that actually did happen, it felt strange to him, and I managed to persuade him to do just one event with me, and it was with the Anglo-Somali Society, which he was part of for a long time and I'm a part of as well. And it was only in that kind of familiar, intimate environment that he could talk about the book as being part of his own life.
And so kind of thinking of your kind of father as a reader of the book, were there places where your kind of choice of language felt shaped by thinking of him reading?
Probably not the language, but probably the content. What do I choose to include and what do I choose to take out? So it started off as a very straight biography of him, and it was only meant to be a few pages long. So just really an account of the highlights of his early life, really. And it just grew and grew and grew, and it was my first creative writing experience, I think, completely. Yep. So I was also working out what I wanted to do with it. So very quickly I realized that it wasn't satisfying just to write it as a short and brief account of his life. I loved learning about Aidan. You know, Aidan in the early 20th century was still so unchanged from how it had been for thousands of years. Very magical. And my father being in amongst that allowed me to kind of explore and have fun with that. And that every other place that he went, I learned more about and enjoyed. And you know, I've always loved fiction, but I also used to read a lot of travel fiction. So the idea of kind of travelling through books was something that was very normal to me. So the more I learnt about places, the more I wanted to put in the book about places for the reader, whoever that might be in the end.
And I think one of the things this project is particularly exploring is the kind of relationship between kind of writing as an act of communication, or I guess writing more as a kind of like writing to create a work of art, kind of a crafts process. And I mean, obviously you've talked about it being a kind of personal thing, but I guess in relation to, because you've obviously published a second novel, you're working on a third. I mean, how would you say you viewed writing in relation to?
I think it's changed. I think the way I viewed it has changed. So this one was almost a polemic, I think, and there was so many parallels. So I was writing in the 2000s, where people were talking about Iraq, they were talking about an American empire, a new American empire. Respectable figures were talking about these sorts of things, and you had the images from Abu Ghraib, and there was such huge parallels between what my father had experienced in the 30s and 40s and what was happening then. And I think you can't help but to take in that environment that you're working in, and it affects the way you shape your writing and what you're writing about and how you're writing about it. So I think that now the book I'm working on is very similar in some respects to Black Mamba Boy. It's about the same community of men, of sailors living in the UK in the 1940s and 50s from Somalia. And it's based on a man that my father knew. But it's also very different in the sense that because he's not my father, there's this distance between us that I can see him in a more objective way. I'm not a griot for the guy I'm working about right now. I'm a friend, or I'm an ally in some respects. Like, he was a victim of a miscarriage of justice. He was executed for a murder he didn't commit. So I'm an ally of his. I think there's no other way you can be. But at the same time, I can be more objective. So I do think that there is a change. That I'm talking about injustice. I'm talking about differences in power, of violence, but I'm doing it in a different way to how I did it here.
Mm-hmm. And before I open kind of questions up to the room, I know lots of people have got questions they want to ask you, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the kind of publishing process. And obviously you kind of talked a bit about it being quite a shock for the book to be kind of out in the world. And I just wondered if there were particular things about the way that you were represented as a writer, or the book were represented kind of through the publishing process or through publicity and media, that either particularly delighted you or that equally particularly irritated you?
My first concern was the editing process. That was my big concern, because it had been so private for so long, and because it was about my father, there were some parameters that I wasn't willing to go beyond. But in both, with my UK editor and my US editor, they did respect that. And the fear that I had that they might want to tone it down wasn't the case. I think the US, there was one scene which we can talk about later, which my US editor did want to trim back, and we worked out a kind of happy medium with it. But in the UK, I felt there was actually quite a lot of freedom. I could say what I want and how I wanted to, in whatever way I wanted. And it was just more a question of shaping the story. The biggest change that happened was in my first manuscript, Jamat's mother survives. She's with him for a lot longer. And it was my editor's suggestion that to break from real life and have the mother die very early on. So the focus is just on Jamat as a young boy in this environment. And that took some convincing, partly because I knew that my father wouldn't like it because it wasn't the truth. And it felt very strange killing off your grandmother. So I didn't want to do that. But she was right. She was right. And when I did that, suddenly other things started to fall into place. It became a kind of neater, sharper story. And the other things around publishing, we talked briefly just about the cover. And I think writers don't normally get much say when it comes to the covers. You're shown it and you're asked to give some feedback, but it's not really within your control. It's very much it's a consensus within the publishing company. So it's very orange in the UK, as you can see, and it's very kind of African fiction-y. It's not, I think that they had an idea about making it as accessible as possible. And I think that was right, and I think people picked it up that might not have if it had seemed, you know, in a different way, a different style of book. So I think it worked. It worked. And this is the American cover, which I really like, and it's of a young boy jumping with illustrated angel wings. And I like this. This is playful. It does have the dust and the bit of orange, but it's a bit more playful. But I have noticed that this is easy to find in every bookshop, which I think every writer is not unhappy with that. Other respects, I think that whole pigeonholing, I guess, of what makes an African writer an African writer. I'm of African descent, I think there's no doubt about that. I'm Somali. But there's, I think, maybe this idea that even though I grew up in the UK, that you're still very different, and I think that's a misapprehension of it. So it's weird, and I think I'm in a particularly weird position because I often do things with the British Council. So I travel with the British Council, and there you're an African writer, but you're also a British writer. So you're often asked about your identity, and something which you don't think about. You don't think about, do I feel British today? Do I feel African today? Do I feel Somali today? It's just part of your everyday, experience and life. And you perceive things through all of those lenses. But you go to a country and suddenly it's kind of like, well, do you feel British? And that, I think, was a bit of a struggle.
Okay, right. We'll now open up for questions. Yeah.
I just want to ask a question about the language of the book, because like you said, you are a British writer, and especially for me, for those readers whose language is not, the first language is not English. But then when I read the book, actually you insert a lot of, I don't know how to categorize, Arabic and also Somali words.
Yeah, various languages.
And being in an academic setting for a long time, usually we italicize or the French or German words. And so my experience of reading this book is there are lots of these foreign words that I was not sure whether they are English words that I'm supposed to know as an Oxford student, or it's just part of the vocabulary borrowed from the setting you were dealing with.
Yes.
So I wondered, when you were writing it, were you aware about the choice of vocabularies?
Yes, it was an active decision, and it was an active decision to not have a glossary, because I've always read books that are from different languages, whether that's books by Indian authors, by South American authors, and I always had the impression that I understood. I would get from the context and the feeling what the word meant, and if I really wanted to, especially now with the internet, you can find it out very easily. But the more I've published and the more I've spoken to readers, I realised that people often don't know what the word meant. And that is actually quite alienating, because the meaning I was trying to get across then is lost, because the meaning I thought was clear is not clear. So that's something I'm thinking about for the book I'm working on right now, because again, it's got lots of languages in it. And then it's got slang as well, English slang, Jamaican slang. So it's a real kind of pot of varied influences, and I don't want the reader to be lost, but I also don't want to lose that texture, and this was normal life. A Somali guy who can speak Hindi, who can speak Arabic, who can, chat and use Cockney slang or criminal slang, whatever it might be. That's just the reality. So I think kind of in an academic setting, you'd have footnotes, and it would be very, very clear. But you can't. I don't want to do that in a fiction. And Juno Diaz is someone I love, and he does in Oscar Wilde, he does have footnotes and lots of Spanish terms, and it's one approach, but I don't think that's the one I want to take with the novel I'm working on now. And I don't think it's a bad thing for the reader to be alienated sometimes. I think when I read novels that are set in places that I've never been, but yet it's somehow too smooth and too Western, or too familiar, I don't know what the word is, then I think there's something missing there. It should feel a little bit alienating when you're reading about culture you don't know about.
So one of the we chose kind of episodes out of the novel that sort of were very memorable, and one of them that I chose was about when Jama is having to carry the carcasses for the butcher, and
Yes.
he stinks afterwards, and all the blood's dried, and he can't even wash because
Yeah.
there's so little water, and which was great, a really great scene.
Yeah, it was
and,
fun writing that.
Yeah, and so one of the questions I wanted to ask was, there's so much energy in that scene, and it's very memorable, and it's very physical, and whether your father, what I felt when I was reading it is that I can imagine him telling you about it. Do you think the energy came from him? Yeah.
Absolutely, I think it did, and I think that's probably why it became that kind of scene, because he was so vivid in his own description, and so proud of himself at the same time, that he was this tiny boy carrying these huge camel carcasses on his shoulders, and it's almost like a metaphor, isn't it? The weight that he's carrying, the burden that he's carrying. So yeah, I think that, and yeah, the idea of waking up at dawn, all of these little boys creeping out of the city, the town, to settle and to work, and even that horrible job is something to be competed over, and is almost like it's a prize. And it's the very beginnings of the physical labour of being a man, of being a colonial man in that environment that he's just getting the first tastes of. Because he did have jobs in Aden as well. He used to collect tennis balls on courts and things like that, and sometimes ferry things from one place to another, but this was the first real physical job I think he had. So yeah, and there's quite a few scenes where it's his energy, I think, that's there. He was a great speaker and a great he loved language. He was someone that kind of was always had a dictionary nearby in multiple languages, and never lost that desire to learn more about language. I think.
Just moving on from Eleanor's question, but still on this amazing energy in the story. How did you? I don't really have a specific question. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how it was to transfer what must have been these long, meandering stories from your father onto the page, whether you use memory a lot, or notebooks, or just sort of whether you referred back to him. Yeah, there's that sort of question.
Yes.
Yeah.
They actually weren't so meandering. And I think because he'd been saying for a long time that his story was worth telling and worth writing, that in a way he had shaped it in his own mind. Because my first intention was to write down everything that he had told me. And I think I did get quite close to that, so it can't have been too meandering. And so some things are probably simplified, and you put lots of slightly different days into one day, or there's some of that going on, but most of it is how he told me. The very first part of the process, and actually it happened by accident. I started recording him or interviewing him while I was still at university here, and I studied a mixture of kind of medieval British history and international relations, Byzantium and the early Islamic kind of empires and things. So it was very, very different to anything from my own background. And I think I love history, and I love all global history, but there was something that I needed to work out within my own background, my own roots, because Somalia had collapsed by that stage, and the only information you could find about it was very negative. And I felt very isolated, I think, probably alienated while being here from my roots, whatever that might mean. So I interviewed him, and that was just a one-off. And then, how did it happen that I actually started interviewing properly? I was interviewing him about a film I wanted to make, about the guy I'm now working on for a book, Mahmoud Matan, who was a Somali sailor that he knew, who was executed in Cardiff in 1952. And I was intending to make a film of him soon after I left university. So to research Mahmoud's story, I sat down with my father to find out what he knew of him. And so he told me a little. He said he's normal, he was medium height, you know, very kind of cursory details. And very quickly it became about him and about his own life and how remarkable it was. And I said, okay, well, let me record this just for family's sake. And my first niece had been born recently at that time, so I wanted to record it for her. So I got my MD recorder and just put a microphone in front of him. And he kind of organized the information. And he went back. So he started before he was born to his own parents, where they were born and their own situations. And he, through family stories, oral history, he thought that one of our ancestors had fought in these big battles between the Somalis and Abyssinians in the 1500s. So it was a very in-depth history, because Somali life is arranged around these clans, and you know, your clan is your ancestry, your grandfathers, and so as well as their name, maybe a tiny bit of their life or their stories might be passed down along with that. So he started at that level and then moved to his birth, and then he stopped when he was about in his early 20s. So he thought that was the interesting part of his life. And maybe if he'd carried on, I don't know what the book would have looked like then, but he was very adamant. After that, his life became boring. So we did that in English, with me asking him questions and kind of pushing him for more details or whatever. But he also did it by himself in Somali, just recording himself on tapes. And that was something he wanted to do, but I also have those tapes. So I had that base knowledge, and to be honest, that was it. I think that was what I needed for the book. But then all the time, we spoke about his life story. I would ask him specific details about things. We'd go over old maps together. We went to the Imperial War Museum together to look at old newsreels from where he lived in Eritrea, in Tessenay, and around those western lowlands. We went to Cardiff together, to the Butetown Arts and History Centre, which has got a large Somali history archive there as well. So it was very collaborative. And he was the person who, you know, when I was starting to lose faith and everything, and I applied to do a PGC to become a teacher, and at the very last minute, I decided to just finish this book and then see what happened. And he was always very supportive. He always thought it was a worthwhile thing to do. And it's partly because, again, of his passion for language and for words, and he saw being a writer as being a dignified profession. Like, not many people do, but he did. So that was the process.
We were just discussing earlier that there are certain scenes in your book which are very graphic in its detail of violence.
I overheard.
I, as a reader, I'm not really terribly perturbed by scenes of violence, but it seems like I was wondering whether you have a certain idea in mind when you're writing these scenes in graphic detail. That do you want to perturb your reader, or do you have something else that you're thinking about while writing these scenes?
I think it's difficult to say, and I'll tell you the genesis. I know the scene you're talking about. It's with Shidan and the Italian soldiers. So that's one of the things that's actually not from my father's experience. But the two boys that it's based on are boys that my father was reunited with. He knew them in Aden, and then they were reunited in Keren. So that part's true. But the violence inflicted on Shidan, that came from, I think, my own, you know, when you're writing a book, all of these things bubble to the surface. And when I was going through the old records, and Sylvia Pankhurst is actually, she wrote this incredible book about human rights abuses in colonial East Africa, in Italian East Africa, in the 1930s. And she compiled story after story of torture, murder, rape, the rest of it. And then it's also, you have these trophy images that the Italians took themselves and have passed on. My mother was aware of them, and she's much younger than that. So she was aware of Italian soldiers asking Somali men, and presumably Eritrean men as well, to lie down. If there's a waterway, to cross it. They would cross it on their backs. And I saw images of heads piled up. You know, this is very graphic. It's very graphic material. There's no way of getting around that. And I think it was a combination of seeing those images and reading about that in the 1930s and 40s, seeing those images later on of Abu Ghraib, And then something which I thought, you know, it was in my mind, I wasn't aware of it, I thought it had disappeared from my mind, but while I was writing, I remembered something which had really got under my skin when I was 15 years old. And it was seeing images from Operation Restore Hope in Somalia. And there were quite a few accounts of human rights. It's such a vague term. I don't even like the term human rights abuses. It doesn't explain what we're talking about, but we'll call it that. So Belgian troops, Canadian troops, American troops, various troops tortured and killed young Somali boys and girls and men and adults. And there was one image that I can still see it in my mind right now, of Canadian paratroopers in a town called Bethlehem, which is between Somalia and Ethiopia on the border. And he was 16 years old. His name was Shillan. So I actually, even before that happened, I'd named the character after him. I don't know why. So yeah, even before I got to that scene, I was thinking about him. I must have been, otherwise I wouldn't have named the character Shillan. So the last moments of his life, there were pictures taken of it, and they're incredibly graphic and terrifying, because the Canadian soldiers are smiling. You know, these are not men ashamed of what they're doing. They're very proud, and his cries could be heard within the camp. So God knows how many dozens of people heard. And there is a fantastic book by Shireen Razak about this whole case, because it was discovered and prosecuted, and one of the men received a very short prison sentence for it. So it's massive, almost like biblical act of violence that I had seen as a young person, and I think had got under my skin. So it was that image that was there, not words. So I guess I was trying to turn that image into words. And my American editor was very much kind of show don't tell, there's other ways of doing it. But I think almost in a political sense, I didn't want to do that. We always look away. We always look away. And this was an opportunity for me and for the reader to not look away. We use a lot of jargon, I think, to distance ourselves from exactly what we're talking about. And sometimes you have to strip that jargon away.
I was wondering, I haven't read the book yet, but from the beats that people chose, I got the sense of a general allegory of life and something, a message beyond the words that that are actually on the pages. I was wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more.
Yes,
sorry, the example was like, what is it? The hyenas.
Yeah.
And the camels and the fact that the hyenas eat the smugglers when they are not paying attention.
Yes, that again is one of my father's favourite things to talk about. As he got older, actually, much later on, after I finished the book, he started having these dreams. And in these dreams, he would jump out of bed because he would be back in Eritrea, in the desert, on camelbacks, with the hyenas following him. So he always talked about hyenas. They had created a massive impression on him. I guess if any kind of terrifying animal was following you, you'd have an impression. I've never had that. I've never experienced that. But there's something magical about walking through this pale desert, just with moonlight, and you know that if you fall, you're dead. That's what he kept saying. If you fall, you're dead. If you broke a limb, you're dead. If you're not able to stay on that camel and go to where you need to go, your life is over. And I think that purity, that moment of realization that your life is fragile but beautiful and you're alive, it was something that in many points of his life, you can feel the intensity of that. So in terms of being almost like a metaphor, I think, yes, you're pursued by different dangers, and you're constantly trying to keep yourself together, keep yourself in movement. And I think being who he was, being young, being a black man in a colonial environment, those hyenas were varied, and that progress you were making physically, spatially, was also something that you couldn't stop. You had to keep moving. And it's something that Toni Morrison writes about in Beloved, where one of the male characters, he says that if you stop, you'll be chained. I'm paraphrasing, and it's not the exact phrase, but that's basically the gist of what he's saying, that if you stop moving, then your life is over. And it's something that, one of my favorite authors, Claude Mackay, also writes about. He writes about Marseille being this kind of melting pot of African and black sailors, from all over the world, fleeing lynchings, fleeing this, fleeing that, and then recreating themselves, but they're still in movement. No one is there forever. They come and go. They run off with a woman, they jump on a train without a ticket. There's just this flux, this constant flux that goes throughout their whole life.
This is a question that follows on a little bit from what Elika was asking. I was struck from the passage you read about the act of memory, especially when the little boy remembers his father's black hair and how he missed him. And from what you've been saying about how your father told you many of the stories, it's partly based on memory, yet it doesn't seem as though it is. So how do you get around that, apart from putting everything into the present?
So it doesn't feel like it's a memory, it feels lived?
Not really. It feels as though it's in the very minute that you're reading it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great thing to hear, thank you. Yeah. How do you... I think the process of writing, so you're hearing it. I'm hearing my father's memories. But when you write, it becomes something else. So it's not his own memory anymore. And it did feel, I described it before as a transfusion of memory, and it is. But then when it enters your own system, you turn it into something else. One of the things that I found difficult with his version of his life was that it was very lonely and very, he had no friends, he had no thoughts, he had no desires. It's kind of like this simple life of just urgent needs. And I can't understand that. Even now, I still don't understand how, once you've met those very, very urgent needs, what does your brain do then? My mind is always kind of going backwards, going forwards, thinking about this. It's so enmeshed in so many different things that I can't put myself. And this is one of the things I think that having a different life to my father means that I can't describe this as a completely authentic account, because I can't do that. He believed that he could live for 30 days without water. I don't believe that. He believed that he witnessed, or believed at least, that a man turned into a hyena. These are places that I can't really go. But all I can do is try and imagine myself into them. And then I think when you're doing that, you're bringing in all of the things that you've read, all of the films that you've watched, all of the music that you've listened to. It becomes a much more sensual and kind of multi-textured thing. And that's what I think you need to do to bring it to life. My own memories come into it, my own emotions. I think one of the saddest scenes in the book for me is actually not the most violent ones. It's one where just before he goes to war in Ethiopia, he's in Ethiopia and he's a tea boy in the middle of nowhere, in a place that he has no connections, no friends. And when it rains, he goes under a shelter. When it stops raining, he starts wandering again. And it's that really atomized life where no one knows you, no one cares about you. It's that deep, deep loneliness that I find most upsetting when I think about it.
Leading on from that question of memory, one of the things I wanted to ask you was kind of when in the writing process you kind of decided to explicitly frame the novel through a kind of father-daughter relationship, as you do with the opening chapter.
Yes, late on. I think this was literally, I think I wrote this book and then I stopped it for a while and wrote a short story and then went back to the book, and these were my creative experiments. So it wasn't until the end of the novel that I really understood what I was trying to achieve and trying to do. And it was in hindsight that I realized that this was like a hymn to him. This is a way of celebrating him. That's why certain things, certain choices that other writers might make about making it more objective, cooler in descriptions sometimes, more reserved about some of the violence. I didn't want to do that because this was a very personal and subjective thing. And there's a book I can recommend by, he's sadly passed away, his name's Amadou Karuma. He's a writer from the Ivory Coast. And he wrote a book called Waiting for the Wild Beasts to Vote, which is similar in some respects. It's the tale of the rise to power of an African dictator, and it's told by a griot who is employed by him. So I guess I was kind of employed by my father to do this as well, and it's that deep. I didn't want to make it a journalism. It wasn't journalism. This was an artistic and also intimate process between me and my father.
That's one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I was also thinking about the theme of belonging in the story, because I think when I read a lot of post-colonial fiction, belonging is one of the central themes. And I noticed that at the beginning of the story, when Gemma just returned to the aunt in
Hargeisa.
And they had a conversation about why his father left, and then Gemma was confused about why he had to leave, because he has a strong sense of this is where we belong.
Yeah.
Right? But then at the end of the story, in the actual interview, and Gemma, the real father, was asked about whether he feels English, and then he's totally comfortable saying that because he have grown up in that space and he feels English.
Yes.
I just wonder how did this sense of belonging change over the years?
I think that it's a big question. It's a big question. I think there's quite a few things going on. I think the fact that Somalis are nomadic is a big part of it. So your sense of belonging isn't to land. In times of stress, they would go as far north as Eritrea with their livestock and as far south as Uganda. So that's a huge, huge distance. And so your belonging isn't to this village. It's to a network of people. And that network of people is flexible. And whenever you can find it, you'll find it in fragments, in Cape Town, in London, in Helsinki, wherever you might be. You'll feel a sense of belonging, because that's how society is arranged. And that doesn't do all of the job, and I think people in my generation, second generation, are now realizing that actually we don't feel that complete sense of belonging in our clan or being Somali. I think it's a much more disturbed process for us. We're told that we're not British enough, we're told that we're not Somali enough, we're not this enough, we're not that enough. So I think it's a much more complicated one. But to go back to my father's generation, so you have the nomadism as a base, and then the fact that my father was raised outside of Somalia for most of his life, most of his childhood. So he left Somalia when he was very young, grew up in Aden speaking Arabic as well as Somali, and then lived in Eritrea for a long time. So his sense of Somaliness, I think, was probably a bit eroded by that. And when I went to Eritrea for research for the book, people looked like him. They were dressed like him. They had the same hats, and I could suddenly see this side to him, which for me, that was just my father. That was his Somaliness, but actually, no, that was his Eritreanness. And then he came to Britain in 1947, and because I'm working on a book around that period of time, I'm amazed that they didn't leave. It was such an incredibly hostile environment and a complicated environment where, it wasn't lynchings generally, it wasn't that kind of violence, but it was just this feeling that you shouldn't be here, we don't want you here. And I would leave. I think confronted with that level of aggression or hostility, I would leave, but they didn't leave. And I think it became like a tussle. It became a tussle between this host nation and these visitors who were British, whether they liked it or not. They had British passports. Somaliland was British. So there was no choice in that. So it was about, marking your space. And my father lived in Hull when most of the time he was in the UK before we arrived. And there was a small group of people of his clan. So he was able to have, that Somaliness within that clan, and then mark out a small part of Hull as well as part of his home. And people did that in Cardiff, they did that in East London, in Sheffield. So I think it felt like it was earned. And because he was a sailor, he travelled everywhere, so he could decide. He nearly lived in the US, he spent quite a lot of time in Australia, he spent quite a bit of time in South Africa. So there wasn't probably a sense that he was forced to live in the UK, and that allowed him to think, out of all of the places I've been, I choose this one. And I think me as a younger person, there isn't that kind of choice. I feel like I grew up here whether I liked it or not. And that gives you a different understanding of your place. But he loved England. I think he liked it a lot. And I did an event in Pune in India as part of the British Council tours, and they were very hostile to the idea of my dad liking England or Britain. And they thought that gave them a sense that the whole book must be Orientalist. And it was their politics, which I generally share, you know, it's not that different from my politics, didn't allow them to think that maybe this elderly person who has fought and fought and fought for this sense of belonging is now going to sit with it and enjoy it. For them, I think it was still a kind of a combat. They were still involved in that combat. But I don't want to be in my 80s and combating somewhere. I think that's too much.
I'm conscious it's 7 o'clock. I know we started a bit late, though. Does that mean we have time for another couple of questions? Or
are there more questions?
Did you go back to Bethlehem? Yes. Yeah, I want to know what happened. Yes.
Yeah? In real life?
In real life.
In real life. See, this was one of the things where my father didn't tell me he had a girlfriend or wife in Eritrea. But when he was in Eritrea, he spoke with it with such fondness and such love that I thought, hold on, he's a young man, completely unsupervised pretty much. You're telling me that he didn't have a romantic relationship. I think he did. So I created Bethlehem, and she's a mixture of all sorts of different things. You know, there's a tiny bit of my mum in there. There's a tiny bit of Dido from the Aeneid. There's some Dylan Thomas in there, Under Milkwood. Yeah. So I had fun with that, and that scene I wrote just before that with Shilan and the Italian soldiers, that was also very taxing for me to write, and it took me a while to build up to it, and then it took me a while to recover from it. And when I finished it, I needed some balm for my own soul, never mind pajamas. So it was a kind of reprieve for both of us. So in real life, I don't know what happened to Bethlehem, his real Bethlehem. Yeah. I presume she stayed in Eritrea. He married my mum much later on when he returned to Hargeisa.
And she came from Somalia?
Yes. Yeah, so she was from Hargeisa. But that was much, much later. But he also, his romantic life was one of the things he didn't want to delve too deeply into. Fair enough. Fair enough. That was actually one of the scenes I was going to read from, actually.
Okay.
I have just one very sort of sneaky question, which is, I have a sneaky question, which is, he is just, and it's not really a proper question. He's just such an astonishing. I'm stating the obvious. He's such an astonishing individual, you know. And there is this thread. We were noticing this earlier of just sort of pure magic, soul light. I think is a word, is a phrase that's used, and there's just this fierce spirit of moving forward. I mean, it's really brilliantly done. I just wondered if it's really a reiteration of my old question, whether it was something that you added, or it was a combination of you and your, and your father
I think that
sharing.
Was the essence. That was the essence of his story that I was trying to get at. And that phrase, I think I in the book I call it slithers of light. Yes. And that was something that I think in Slaughterhouse 5, Kurt Vonnegut says something similar about two men there, and I was like, yes, this is my father. It's just pure human energy, all the gutsiness that involves, the courage, and the idea that it can be extinguished so easily. And when I went to Eritrea, I went to the military cemeteries that they have there for the British and also for the Italians, and the Italian cemetery has the headstones with names and birthdays, death dates of the Italian soldiers, but of the Ascaris, it's just unknown soldier, unknown soldier, unknown soldier. So the idea that he could have so easily have just been one of those people, just that unknown soldier, but he wasn't, and he got through it all, and he was happy, and he's one of the few people that I think, every day was like a miracle and was amazing, and simple things were pleasurable. The TV was pleasurable. Not having to go anywhere was pleasurable. Having food in the fridge was pleasurable. All of it. And I think that's something that, my friends, we don't have. It's more kind of, what do we lack? What can we fix? It's much more that mentality. And I don't, he's not some kind of primeval man or anything like that. He was still very political. He was still very much, reflecting of what it took. And it took his mother as well. It wasn't just him. It took his mother to kind of stoke that fire that was there and say, hold on a second, you're meant to be someone. The spirits have told me, the signs have told me, the fortune tellers have told me, you are meant to be someone, you are meant to travel the world. And I think all of that kind of fired that spirit up.
So it'd be great if we could finish with you reading to us again from the novel.
So this is actually from one of Bethlehem's bits. Bethlehem Big Head was a mule, with a Tigray father and a Konama mother, Muslim and Christian, born in a cowshed, a shepherdess in the morning, a farmer in the afternoon, and a shop girl in the evening. With a head full of dreams and fantasies, she would pluck lavender and jasmine and come home with blooms in her braids, but minus a goat, only to be beaten and sent back out into the darkening hills until she had found it. Her black thicket of hair earned her the name Big Head, and she wore it like a crown of thorns, pulling at it throughout the day, plucking strands from her eyes, from her mouth, from her food. When her sisters jumped her, they used her hair as a weapon, forcing her head back with it and dragging her across the dirt. Her mother would sometimes put an afternoon aside to laboriously braid it, laying it down into manageable rows like their crops, before, like a rainforest, it burst out of its man-made boundaries and reclaimed its territory. She was a true village girl, in that she wanted nothing more than to live in the town. Already 16, she had to wait for her 5 older sisters to marry before she could escape. Jama's face came to her now before she fell asleep. His deep, hypnotizing eyes saddened her, and there was something about his lost and lonely bearing that made her want to suffocate him in her bosom. From her perch on the hills, amid the bleating goats, Bethlehem could see Jama in his turban, planting seeds. He was clumsy with his tools, and to her amusement, he would pull seedlings out of the earth to see how much they had grown. He was trying to stare them into life, she thought. When she brought the goats back down, Bethlehem sidled past his field. You're not doing that very well, you know. You shouldn't plant them so deep. They need to see the sun through the earth. Why don't you come and help me then, Jama said, stopping to stare as she walked past. You wish, she squealed before striding away. Jama studied the cycles of her day. He loved to watch her make her yawning advance up the hill in the dappled dawn light. She was a spot of red climbing up the grey-green horizon, her faithful retinue of stinking goats shouting after her. At midday she would descend, her ramrod straight back, holding up that black flag of hair, and begin work on her mother's fields. He could smell the flowers in her hair long after she had passed. Jama would wait until she was in the shop in the evenings before going to buy his eggs and milk. And they talked by paraffin lamp while her family ate dinner. What did you do before coming here? She asked once. I was in a scurry. How stupid he must have been, she taunted, holding a blade of grass between her fingers in imitation of his cigarette. The womb light of the lamp made them both braver, able to talk about things that bright light or deep darkness would have prohibited. Jama told Bethlehem about his parents, and she listened with the attention of a sphinx. In return, to cement their intimacy, Bethlehem described to Jama how her father kicked her for daydreaming and losing goats, how she had never been bought anything her whole life, but only given her sister's hand-me-downs. Not one thing, Jama. Can you believe that? Never one thing, for me only. Jama shook his head in sympathy and touched her hand. She let him for a second before pulling away.